First, I want to say how thankful I am that I've been able to spend my career at Andrews University. It's been a wonderful place to do research. I've had wonderful support from my department, Dr. McBride, from my school, Dr. Mattingly, from the Office of Scholarly Research, Gary Burdick and Kristen Arthur, and of course the university as a whole, Andrea Luxton. I think we have come a long ways, and I'm especially happy that now with all the research we are doing, we're also featuring it on our website. Today I'm going to talk about my own journey in research. This is a rather lofty title that I've chosen, Globality, its implications for research and creative scholarship at Andrews. I'm going to talk briefly about globality and then show how it has forced me to rethink, to visit and search again. That's really what this whole presentation is about. It's the evolution of the frame of reference from which I have looked at the same site over my career. I want to start with this great psalm. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. For the Lord, there is a full earth. It is all of it His. But for us as human beings, it's probably true that we are bound to our localities, to our world regions, to our nations, to even our provinces where we live. We don't think of the world as a whole normally. But we're being challenged today to think about the world as a whole because of the process that we call globalization. This is the single most important social process that's happening in our world today. It explains more of the changes that are occurring than practically any other social process that's occurring. Since about 1980, the term has spread like wildfire across the world. People are talking about globalization in all kinds of contexts. It is an irresistible force, smashing national boundaries, overturning established patterns of thought and conduct. It is transforming both rich and poor countries, creating enormous wealth for some and great poverty for others. It is bringing a wide range of societies into contact, creating a world in flux. It is forcing us to rethink long-held assumptions about how the world works. Now, globality is a closely related concept, and it's in a way a new point of view, a new way to see the world. It's a point of view made possible by recent advances in technology, the ability to see the Earth from space, the ability to connect with the whole world from one's bedroom in the morning. You can connect with people all around the world. Is making people become aware of a bigger world than we used to live in before. Before we perhaps lived in a nation. Maybe we considered ourselves to be Europeans, or perhaps we were South Americans. But today, more and more, we are becoming aware that we are part of this one entity, the globe. This term globality refers to the condition of being global, or world, if you wish, after globalization. So therefore, unlike globalization, globality is not just a one-way street of the West impacting the rest. It is really a condition in which all of the world is connecting. And while that we are still not quite there, the fact is that we are rapidly moving beyond the process of the West impacting the rest to the whole world being networked together in one system. And so this concept of globality then offers a new narrative, a new template for organizing knowledge in the humanities, the natural and the social sciences. And so globality then is a new narrative, a new framework from which to look at the world, from which to look at our particular, through which to look at our particular lines of research. James Wirch has examined the role of narrative templates as cultural tools that we use for understanding and interpreting the past, for understanding underlying collective memory in the case of history. Narrative templates organize historical knowledge into plausible wholes. We make sense out of the past through narrative templates. And so this brings me to my own journey in research, which goes back to 1971, to the days of Siegfried H and the Heshbon expedition, which excavated a site called Tal Hispan in Jordan. And here we see the site. So I'm going to give you another case study of how we have approached this site and the narrative templates with which we have approached the site. And I'm going to start with where we began and how I have come up today to look at the site through the eyes of globality. Now, an archaeological tell, it's an Arabic term, this term tell, and it simply means a hill or a mound formed by the accumulated remains of past human occupation. In the case of Tel Hespan, its occupational history spans over 3 millennia, from about 1200 BC right down to the present. But as a mound, it is an unnarrated landscape feature. There's nothing about the site itself that tells you this is biblical Heshbon or this is a Roman Heshbon. It is simply an accumulation of human remains. But as scholars, we come to our work with a narrative, with a particular template. And so this was the case with the Heshbon expedition. We were searching for a particular past. Just as a tourist guide, when he takes people through a site, they talk about the past as they understand the past, but also in appealing to the preferred pasts of their tourist members. And so what are desired pasts? Desired pasts typically evoke a strong sense of longing. As longed for, desired pasts, the Exodus and the conquest narratives have a significant worldwide institutional and individual constituency. So when we came to Heshbon, this unnarrated site, we came with a desired past. We were interested in the stories of the Old Testament, the Iron Age story, the Late Bronze and Iron Age story of the Exodus. This fact has presented one of the greatest challenges to our efforts to narrate the history of Heshbon through time, especially given the fact that Heshbon is located in an Arabic country, which has a rich history also of Islamic culture, with which we were not prepared to engage when we initially came. So here's the artist's rendition of a desired past, namely in this case the Israelite conquest of Amorite Heshbon. That's what animated Siegfried H as he organized the dig to Heshbon in 1967 together with Richard Hamill, president of Andrews. They had a constituency of stakeholders interested in this particular past, and thus organized a group of students and faculty from Calvin, Andrews, and other theological seminaries to look for the biblical past, a particular desired past in Heshbon. And fortunately, they found something quite relevant, a very extensive evidence of a pool that could very well be linked to the biblical story of Solomon, who spoke of his lovers, his beautiful Shulamite girl. Her eyes are like the pools of Heshbon, and that became a kind of a confirmation of the fact that we are at biblical Heshbon, a fulfillment, if you wish, of the desired past. However, Iron Age archaeology, or the archaeology of the biblical period, is a desired past, but it is not sufficient to interpret the tell as a whole, that is the archaeological mound, because the archaeological mound has not just been there for the Iron Age, it also has accumulated in later periods. So we might say that, in a sense, it's a very small tent within which to interpret the real fact on the ground, which is the site itself. We need a bigger tent within which to fit this narrative. And so we had to reinvent, revisit, if you wish, our agenda for working in the site. And that project was the work of these three pioneers, Siegfried H himself, who was open to more than just maybe focusing on the biblical period, Roger Boris, the stratigrapher, who was committed to careful excavation, and Larry Garrity, who was committed to bringing the best scholars and multidisciplinary approach to the work in Hespan. So we are now trying to create a bigger tent that'll be better fitted to understand the depth of layers, the multiple layers of Hespan. And the fact is, as we look at the site itself, we see these many layers that include the Iron Age, the biblical, but it also includes the Roman, the Byzantine, and the later Arabic layers. We also were fortunate to have one of Larry Geraghty's colleagues from Harvard University, Jim Sauer, who was an expert on identifying pottery sherds, and he took it upon himself to break new ground. We knew nothing at that time about the vast amount of pottery from the Islamic periods. In fact, in many other parts of Palestine and Israel at the time when we were working, these later Islamic periods were bulldozed away. They simply did not fit the narrative template. But at Heshbon, we were, after all, in Jordan, and we couldn't just bulldoze away what didn't fit our narrative. We had to engage, and so Jim Sauer engaged with the pottery from the Islamic period. And as a young graduate student at the time, I came prepared to look at the animal bones. Again, something that was typically thrown away, but actually which became an opportunity because these animal bones opened a window on the economic relationships that in fact created possibilities for human life. And that gave rise to a new narrative template, which now has which is a more comprehensive template. The food systems research approach studies all of the interrelated activities carried out by people in their quest for food and for water. It is a question you can ask of any period. It's not just restricted to a particular period. And by focusing on the different components of the food system, how food is procured, how it is protected, how it is harvested, processed, distributed, stored, preserved, prepared, how water is procured, how it's consumed, disposed, and even the organization of beliefs around food and the production of food. Now you suddenly have a whole new framework for interpreting the pottery, the bones, the types of building remains that we find. It all comes into new focus because, in fact, most of what's accumulated in an archaeological mound are not cultic objects or inscriptions, but they are, in fact, the daily remains of the food system. So suddenly we have a much more powerful framework with which to interpret the actual accumulated materials within an archaeological mound. This led to my doctoral work, which involved reconstructing boom and bust in the economy of Heshbon over 3,000 years. And this slide shows how over time you have a period during which people settle down and become more focused on growing cereals and grapes and orchard crops, and then they abandon the sites and they become more nomadic. And then this goes back again to settled ways of life and so forth, cycling through time. And as this happens, we have what we call a process by which people either sedentarize, settle down, or they nomadize. So it's not a unilinear development, but instead a cyclic boom and bust in the intensity with which the land is used. So the food systems perspectives then provides a more comprehensive narrative. Our tent is bigger. We can explain more about the site now because we have widened, we have rethought and expanded our theoretical framework. Now then, in 1982, we made the decision to continue the work in the central highlands of Jordan. But to the work in Heshbon, we added two further sites, Tel Omeri and Tel Jalul, and they are shown here. And since 1982, we have continued to work at all three sites. And this has been, for us as a group that have worked together, and for Andrews University, a tremendous advantage, because we've been able to use this region as a laboratory, not only for drawing out data, but for also testing new theories and frameworks for thinking and interpreting those data. To the point that today, our team, we are involved at the highest levels of our professional organization. I'm the chair of the Committee on Archaeological Policy that approves all 70 projects that are sponsored by American universities in the Middle East. And Larry Herr is the editor of the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research. In other words, this work in theory building has benefited greatly our ability to also give to our profession through having concentrated on this. Now, during the later work, we've tried to go deeper into why is it that we have these cycles of ups and downs. And one of the interesting things that we come to understand is how important local practices, the indigenous knowledge of people has been. And so that led to the insight that people have had to cope with a constant challenge of survival through the centuries, which is reflected here in the baking of bread on a little plate. This practice has been going on for millennia. The simplest daily activities have very deep roots in Jordan. And likewise, the use of caves. For so many years, I think I worked at Hespan for 15 years before I really realized that the caves were an integral part of the settlement system. Because coming to the Middle East from the West, we think of caves as belonging to the cavemen, but it's not a viable place to live. But in fact is, caves to this day are lived in many parts of the world, including Jordan, and it expands our understanding of the settlement system, important part of the settlement system. In fact, the way that the regions are typically settled when sedentarization occurs is that people begin to camp near caves, then they begin to build walls and houses in front of the caves, and eventually they'll build stone houses. And that process has repeated itself. They've abandoned it, and then they come back and they rebuild in front of the caves. We've seen it multiple times in Jordan. And so in 1997, after having been away from Hespan for 20 years, we worked there until 1976. We come back in 97 because the place was a mess. You couldn't hardly get to the summit. And with the support of the Department of Antiquities, we undertook to restore the place and to make it presentable to tourists and to continue to deepen our explanation of the boom and bust patterns in the settlement system. And that led to a quest for a broader framework than just looking at the food system, namely world history. And to that extent, I've had to kind of define what I mean by two key terms. One is civilization. A civilization is a luminous constellation of radiant attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, values, elite cultural traditions, and institutions of works of art, artisanry, and architecture that emanate from a particular geographical center. That definition goes a long ways toward explaining what I have happening in Hespan. And then I also define empire as an expanding order that carries forward the civilizing mission of a particular civilization. Now, great and little traditions are part of this story. And so a great tradition refers to the culture of an elite in a state-organized society with a tradition that is usually written and not fully shared by the non-literate village-level commoners, whereas the little traditions refer to the culture of communities such as villages or tribes whose local knowledge and non-literate traditions are not fully shared by the elite. Now, Hespan, it turns out, is a place with a series of civilizations that have radiated their influence to the role of different empires, such as the Romans, who built these beautiful Acropolis stairways in Jerash, and then in the right slide, the stairway in Hespan, following the template of the Roman system. So likewise, we have the Byzantines, the early church people. They had a template that they imposed. The Byzantine Empire with their Basilica Church. We have the Basilica Church in Hespan. Again, then we have the Umayyads and the Mamluks, two Islamic imperial influences in the site. And so we can see that in Hespan we have these great traditions that keep repeating themselves and that download from the imperial centers of civilization their practices so that the local people then give their own version of the Roman, in this case, or the Byzantine culture. So this process of a civilization influencing and spreading its influence and downloading it to a local region is what explains the typical remains in Hespan. So we now have a framework that accounts for the great tradition. The elite remains in Hespan, but at the same time, we have to focus on how people have survived under this march of empires, of elite traditions. And these are the little traditions, the way of life of people, and their way of providing for water, local level water management, taking care of cisterns and springs, their ability to be both cereal farmers and shepherds, their ability to live in a tent, a cave, a house, shifting back and forth, their ability to use lands in different ways, to have fluid borders, manages risks, and then hospitality, not just good manners, but a way to gather important information for survival, honor and shame, a system for social control, for managing people without police or government, and finally the tribe itself, which is the network that ties and reproduces this knowledge of the local people, so that in the end, the little traditions survive underneath the great traditions. And so therefore Hespan is a kind of a palimpsest, a text on which you have, on the one hand, these great imperial stories or traditions, and then the local people living their life underneath. Now, this great tradition framework is an even more comprehensive narrative. It allows us to explain more about the site. But now, in this day of globality, we need to go even further. And so this is what is global history? How does it expand upon what we have already done? Well, global history studies the cumulative impact and career of humanity on planet Earth. Unlike world history, the starting point is not the histories of nations, empires, and civilizations. Instead, it is the perspective made possible by modern technology. And so global history is what we are now trying to do. And these are stories about about great religious revivals and movements, about the fall and rise of empires, about migrations and displacements of people. And the work now that we are doing in the Madaba Plains seeks to illuminate these global histories that can be compared all over the world. These are global stories that are being told in each of our sites in different ways. And so by focusing even more broadly, we have created a tent with which we can connect what we are doing in the Eastern Mediterranean with work that's happening in China, in other parts of the world, and thus globality, this challenge of thinking broadly about how we do our work, is now reshaping further our agenda so as to create a space for doing research that is big enough to accommodate all of the kinds of research going around that happens in all the parts of the globe. This does not cancel out biblical archaeology at all, but rather it challenges us to reframe biblical archaeology in ways that what we do is not just looking for a desired past, but we are relating what we are finding in these biblical sites to similar processes occurring on a global scale. So finally, we are now in the process also of presenting these results to the public, and this is just a drawing presenting the ways in which we're going to narrate the story to the public. Because of time, I'm going to stop right there because I want to be able to give my colleague his time as well. So I will stop with that, and thank you for your interest.